Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our In Conversation IIASA webinar, and it's my particular pleasure to welcome George Monbiot, who has kindly agreed to join us on this seminar. So, yes, George is to some extent a jack of all trades. He's a zoologist by training, and he's then turned into environmental writing. He's an environmental journalist, also writing books, and he's a very passionate commentator on all sorts of environmental and political issues, has to be added. Writing a great column in The Guardian, through which I have actually come to know your name, so to say, George. He's also an activist, has been for a long time, and now more recently I've learned George is also a great gardener, a great horticulturalist, indeed someone who's exploring the very soil on which we are living. And indeed, he's a wonderful applied systems analysis, which brings him right here to us, to IIASA. So George is also a member, in fact, a guest researcher on Piero's program on biodiversity. And now it's my very pleasure to host him for a conversation on the food system. George, maybe I give the word very quickly to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's great to be here and to see you again. So yeah, thank you for hosting me.
Very much so. Thanks, George. So the kind of general context of our conversation is a book George has written and published about a year ago, I think. It's called Regenesis. I heartily recommend a read, but it's kind of, we agreed that this conversation would not be so much about the book itself, but rather kind of about the general context. So it's really exploring the food system from cradle to grave, you could say. So it's starting with the very soil and kind of ends up through agriculture and ends up with the consumers and policy making and all you can think of. So it's a wonderful read, and I'm not going to spoil things. So some of this is going to pop up in our conversation for sure. George is both exploring kind of very rigorously and to some extent mercilessly the shortcomings and failures of the food system as it stands, but he doesn't stop there. He's actually coming up with really intriguing and some possibly path-breaking thoughts on how it could be mended and actually made to work for us. The study is really intriguing on a number of grounds, I found. So it's a mix of kind of introspection, but then for mostly a really profound scientific reading, which is an underpinning, I understand, of all of your works, George. And it's synthesizing a literature which is spanning kind of all sorts of system boundaries. Well, spanning and transcending them. And it includes, as an important part, what at IIASA we would probably call a stakeholder approach. So you've been talking to a lot of kind of people who've playing a great role, having great ideas in all of this. And finally, you come up with a set of very clear-cut, very outspoken, some provocative, but all of them thought-provoking policy conclusions. So at the end, I found actually reading the book, it's a great piece of applied systems analysis. That said, let us move on to talk about some of the contents. And George, I hope you're not angry at me, but let me prompt you maybe to summarize for our listeners sort of 3 or 4 you have your choice, key insights from this research you've been doing, including all the conversations you had. So what would you think is the takeaway, the main takeaway?
Well, there are quite a few. It's a complex and ramifying subject about a series of complex systems. Maybe we could start with the food system itself as a complex system, which is showing many of the signs of systemic fragility, the loss of resilience that we saw with the global financial system in the approach to 2008. And we've seen the increased amplification of shocks across the network, which seems to explain what is otherwise inexplicable, which has been the reversal of the chronic hunger trend. Between about 1960 and 2014, we saw a fairly steady decline in chronic hunger. And in 2014, people were very optimistic that we would hit Sustainable Development Goal 2.1, which is an end to hunger, by 2030. And then in 2015, it went into reverse, and the number of chronically hungry people has been rising ever since. It's been greatly exacerbated, of course, by the COVID pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but that's not what started that trend. Strikingly, that trend began when food prices were historically low. And for the first 5 years of that rise in global chronic hunger, they stayed historically low. And what seems to have happened is that as the system has become less resilient, as it's begun losing the key elements of what makes a complex system robust, the shocks, which may start as comparatively minor ones, amplified across that system, land on the poorest nations. And the result of that is that local food prices can spike while global food prices remain low. And what we're seeing in the outputs of this system is what systems theorists might call flickering, and they should make us extremely alarmed at the prospect, which I now think is a very real one, of global food system collapse. If the financial system had collapsed, it would have been extremely disruptive and caused misery for very large numbers of people. But if the global food system goes down, we're talking a completely different scale of misery. And governments were able to bail out the global financial system at the 11th hour by creating future money. That's what they call quantitative easing. You cannot bail out the global food system by creating future food. So we have to act on this now. We have to reintroduce the crucial elements of resilience. That means breaking up some of the food corporations which have become too big to fail. It means reintroducing diversity into the system, asynchronicity, redundancy, circuit breakers, backup systems, and modularity, the compartmentalization of the system in order to make it more robust. And so some of the recommendations in the book are about that. So looking at it very much from a systems point of view. But then also I'm looking at the pressures bearing upon that system from outside, as it were. So the enormous environmental pressures now piling up on the food system. And in fact, there was someone just yesterday published, it was just a thread on Twitter, but he compiled all the news stories which relate rising food prices to environmental shocks. And it's a long list. And we're seeing environmental shocks already as being a major driver of food price increases around the world. They will undoubtedly soon become the major driver, but also they'll become the major source of shocks amplified across the system, contributing to its instability. But on top of that, we have this possibly the most frightening of all environmental trends, which is the rise in the consumption of animal products worldwide. And it's amazing to me the extent to which environmentalists have taken their eye off this ball. You know, we quite rightly talk about the need to leave fossil fuels in the ground. It is just as important to stop farming animals, because livestock production hits every single Earth system, and it hits it just as hard as fossil fuels do in all sorts of ways. So principally as a result of livestock production, farming and food production are the primary cause of habitat destruction, of deforestation, of wildlife loss, of species extinction, of land use, this crucial neglected issue, of freshwater use, of soil degradation, and among the primary causes of climate breakdown, freshwater pollution and air pollution, and yet we scarcely discuss it as one of our top environmental priorities. It should be the top one of all. And unfortunately, the main driver of this, which is livestock consumption, is driven by what seems to be a very hardwired human trait, which is known as Bennett's Law, which is that as people become more prosperous, they go for a more energy-dense diet, particularly one which is higher in protein and fats, and that generally translates into eating more animal products. And worldwide, we're seeing a very sharply increasing trend. People talk about the population crisis, and they mean the human population, but actually the human population is one of the very few environmental indicators that's leveling off. It fell below 1% growth rate last year, which was a massive moment, not marked by any media, but in November last year, for the first time in many decades, it fell below 1%. It's heading towards the plateau, probably about mid-century. There is a population crisis, however, which is the livestock population crisis that's growing at 2.4% a year. To put it in crude terms, by 2050, there'll be 100 million tons of extra human being on Earth and 400 million tons of extra livestock on Earth. It's already the case that of the weight of mammals on Earth, only 4% are wild, 36% are humans, 60% are livestock. Livestock is crushing the life out of this planet above any other factor, and we desperately need to wake up to that. So that sort of sets some of the ground for what I then go on to explore as in terms of the possibilities of what we can do about these great and gathering crises.
Yeah, thank you very much, George, for this tour de force kind of summary of your points. I mean, in fact, that leads me right into the sort of next question, which, having read the book, I was taken many messages, but sort of the key transformations which you are talking about in some way are the kind of defarming, and you made kind of a very clear point about this even as you were speaking now. The other one, and maybe you can also comment on this a little bit, which is, well, depending on how you see it, I found a kind of a positive story almost, that there's actually a lot to be gained to be working with a soil system, as you could call it, rather than replacing the soil system and then trying all sorts of artificial things to get plants out of the ground and keep them healthy by pouring on them fertilizers and pesticides, herbicides, you name it. And this is also, I think, quite a new perspective on things. And maybe you can tell us a little more about this.
Thank you. So we owe our existence to a very large extent to advances in the understanding of soil chemistry and of the chemistry as it applies to plants. A very large number of us would not be here on Earth if it weren't for the Haber-Bosch cycle and the recognition that by adding certain chemicals, certain minerals to the soil, you can increase productivity. About 50% of us rely on average on artificial nitrogen. But this cannot last. The extreme degradation of soils around the world, including some of the best agricultural soils of all, severely compromises our ability to continue to feed ourselves. And our future prospects of continuing to feed ourselves from farming, and it will always remain the case that a significant amount of our food will need to come from farming, regardless of the other innovations that I'd like to talk about. Our continuing ability to feed ourselves from farming will depend not so much on our understanding of soil chemistry as on our understanding of soil biology, which is one of the most neglected of all scientific fields, but arguably also one of the most important. Soil biology, many aspects of it are more or less a black box. Now, of course, you can't separate soil biology from soil chemistry or from the material science of soil or from the physics of soil. All these things are intimately connected, and all of them are intimately neglected. soil produces 99% of our calories, and yet we don't even know what it is. And that sounds like a remarkable statement, but in 2020, there was a paper published called Soil as a Composite Extended Phenotype of the Microbial Metagenome. I'm sure you've all read it. And it was a fascinating, extraordinary paper, but in it, it said words to the effect of, we think we might know what soil is now. Anyway, I caught up with the authors of that paper last year, and we had a picnic together, and I said, so, yeah, how's the work going? And they said, well, in the light of subsequent research, we haven't a clue what soil is. It's so bizarre. It behaves in such weird ways. So if we just take that that paper I mentioned, what they found was that there's what they call a sort of genomic response going on across all microbes all at the same time within the soil. That if you reduce soil carbon, DNA length shrinks across the entire microbial genome, regardless of species. And at the same time, the number of RNA operons rises, suggesting a collective metabolic response. I mean, they don't put it in these terms, but it's almost as if the soil is a kind of giant organism. But we can't say that. We can't say it is or it isn't, but because we really, really don't understand what's going on. And this is an extraordinary situation in which we find ourselves. The key resource on which we are totally dependent. We have no understanding of it at all. Leonardo da Vinci said, we know more about the movement of the cosmic spheres than we do about the ground beneath our feet. And that remains true in 2023. Yet, what we do understand, or are beginning now to understand, about the extraordinary relationships between plants, microbes, and soil physical structure suggests that there's a tremendous promise in understanding and exploring those relationships and using them to maintain or enhance crop yields without wrecking the ecosystem, the soil on which those yields depend. And that we can replace some of our reliance on soil chemistry by means of a better understanding of soil biology. And one of the chapters in the book follows a grower, someone who produces vegetables mostly and a bit of fruit, who anticipated in some respects certain aspects of soil ecology by about 20 or 30 years, and really had almost an intuitive understanding of the extraordinary relationship between plants, bacteria, and fungi, and how to mediate that relationship. And his approach, this man's called Ian Tolhurst, or Tolly, his approach really began with his recognition that what we call agricultural soils in Europe are to a large extent woodland soils, and that they behave best when they think they're still woodland soils. And so with a few very small tweaks, without any fertilizer or indeed any other farm chemicals, or any animal manure, or indeed any compost, he's managed to double his yields and improve soil fertility. And this is just one example of many, many ways in which we can start to engage with this fascinating subject of soil biology. But boy, do we need to learn more about it. And this is a massively neglected subject. We need a huge injection of funds into soil science. We need to be recruiting soil scientists. We need undergraduate degrees generating a new generation of soil scientists, because I think our survival could depend on that. Here we are spending billions of dollars on the Mars rover program to characterize the surface of that planet. And yet we're spending just a fraction of that money on characterizing the surface of our own, which actually we understand less well than the surface of Mars, because regolith, which coats the surface of Mars, is actually really easy to understand. It is basically just stuff. Whereas what we're looking at here is an extremely complex and difficult to study ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. You have, well, partly kind of preempted involuntarily. So the next question I wanted to ask based on this, but I think it still ties in very nicely, and that is, you mentioned the person called Tolly, and yes, this is this great grower, and who's relying on working really with nature. Also, I think he's the one who's promoting stock-free horticulture, namely not drawing on any animal inputs. And besides that, besides him, you're portraying a number of great characters, wonderful people. I'm absolutely sure. They have partly very idiosyncratic backgrounds. I think Tolly being one of them, and you put it very nicely, where they came from and how they came about doing the things they are doing. Now, drawing on this, I was wondering, and I should say maybe not just I, but let me point this out. At this point, we had a little team working together, trying to think about reflecting your work and come up with a number of questions. So on this occasion, thanks to all of them. But yes, one thing we were debating and were wondering about, given these characters are there, and there are surely many more. Now, given the scale of the challenge of this transition, and given the speed by which we need to work on this, how do we do it? I mean, how do we kind of consolidate and scale this bunch of this expertise which is here and there? How do we get to it? I mean, you mentioned already that we need massive investments in education on soil science in this case, but maybe you can expand a little more. And let me also give you right away the next question. At one point, you're also drawing the reader's attention to the fact that, well, this is not just about decentralized, nice little projects. We may actually need to rely on corporations for some of this scaling. So that's another challenge. So let me give these two to you, because I think they go together somehow.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we every issue that you've touched on there has been greatly neglected by governments and by the media and in public life in general. And there are some brilliant scientists working in all those fields, and other academics working in all those fields. And they publish magnificent papers in the academic press, and they never escape from the academic press. There's just no take-up in the media. There's no take-up by politicians. I mean, I was talking about the threats to the food system caused by the system itself, the systemic internal threats to the food system. And almost no representation of that issue anywhere in the media. And people publish their lists of the greatest existential risks that humanity faces, and it's always AI and nuclear power and new pandemics and stuff, you know, which are all valid concerns. But I would put global food system collapse in the top two, and no one ever does. No one touches it because no one knows about it outside of academic circles. And this is the case with issue after issue in this area. There's a public conversation about food and farming, a very lively public conversation, but it bears almost no relationship to what's in the scientific press. It's as if the two things are operating in different worlds altogether. And that's a terrifying place to be, because the public conversation is grossly misinformed. And it's highly dependent on myths, on deep unexamined beliefs, on gut feelings, which maybe is appropriate because we're talking about food, but those can't guide us through the 21st century. And above all, it's dominated by pictures. We like the look of this, so that's what everyone should be doing. We like the look of cattle grazing in fields, so we should all eat pasture-fed meat. And they're not looking at the numbers. I mean, we are as a society food innumerate. We don't do the numbers. And, you know, the pasture-fed meat thing is a classic example where, you know, we like the sound of that because that resonates with stories that go back thousands of years about how the shepherd with his sheep or the cowboy with the cows the virtuous and pure person, this hunky person living robustly in the countryside, and the city is the cauldron of evil and corruption. And so we say, oh yeah, that sounds good, pasture-fed meat, but there's just no attempt to look at what would happen if we follow that advice, except in the scientific literature. And there's one paper saying what would happen if everybody did as the celebrity food writers tell them to do, and switch from eating corn-fed beef to pasture-fed beef in the United States. Now, corn-fed beef is enough of a disaster already, but the only thing that could make it worse is switching to pasture-fed beef, because they found out that you would need to increase the area used for keeping cattle in the United States by 270%. So you'd have to cut down all the forests, you'd have to drain all the swamps, you'd have to water all the deserts, you'd have to degazette all the national parks, you'd have to demolish all the cities, and you'd still be importing much of your beef from Brazil. You know, we could all eat pasture-fed beef if we had several planets and no space for wild ecosystems on any of them. But given that we've got one planet and we also need wild ecosystems, in fact, we need far more wild ecosystems than we got at the moment if we're going to get through this century, then we just can't afford to do it. It's the worst possible thing to be eating. But because we're not seeing the numbers, we don't understand that. It's all pictures where there should be numbers. And so one crucial effort is to get those numbers into public life. And that's not easy. You know, we're up against a hostile media, very often up against hostile governments, but we've got to find better ways of getting people to understand these fundamental things that academics understand and nobody else does. And then you've got these problems then reinforced by corporate lobbying, which just wants things to stay the same. I mean, that's basically what corporate lobbying does. It wants things to stay the same or to become worse, because corporations and oligarchs, they benefit from business as usual. That's why they are the leading corporations or oligarchs, because they have benefited so much from the way things are. So they don't want any significant challenge or threat to business as usual. And they do want to ramp things up by clearing regulations out of the way, by clearing taxation out of the way, by clearing protesters out of the way. And of course, they get their way again and again with governments that are far too sympathetic towards them. Now, in your second question, we talk about the issue of corporations, and it's a really difficult one because it's corporate concentration and power which threaten the integrity of the global food system. To give one example, on one estimate, 4 corporations control 90% of the global grain trade. And this is a far greater concentration than the concentration in the financial sector before 2008, which turned out to be so dangerous. And there are also extreme concentrations of corporate power in seeds, in chemicals, in machinery, in processing, in wholesaling, in retailing, in the fast food chains. I mean, right the way across the field, from farm to fork, we got immense concentration of corporate power, and that's extremely dangerous. And so a lot of people have responded to this by saying, well, the answer is localization. You know, if the problem is these huge global corporations, which it undoubtedly is, that is undoubtedly part of the problem, the answer is to localize food production. And then there's all this discussion about why it hasn't been localized. And people talk about, corporate power and standardization and things, and all those are real. But the biggest reason why food production has not, on the whole, been localized is maths. Again, it's the numbers, and people aren't looking at the numbers. And there is a study in, I think, Nature Food, looking at what is the minimum distance over which the world's people can be fed. And the average minimum distance is 2,200 kilometers. And the reason for that is that we live in cities or in densely populated valleys, in places where there's a lot of people and not much land. And those places tend not to have sufficient agricultural hinterlands nearby to feed that population. There's just not enough good land close to where such large numbers of people live. And so we remain highly dependent on big, largely empty lands, such as the US Midwest, the Canadian prairies, the Brazilian interior, the Russian steppes, the Ukrainian Chernozem, from which we import so much of our grain. And that's a dangerous situation, but it's also hard to see how we can escape from that situation. And that is just raw maths. And, you know, like this is where I think my proposals are weakest in the book, because it's very hard to see how we can break that corporate deadlock. I mean, I want to break up the individual corporations, but where you've got long distance trade, it will inevitably tend towards concentration. That's what happens with long distance trade. And so, you know, I talk in slightly vague terms about, you know, we need a revitalized fair trade movement where we can plug small producers into that large scale globalized trade, but you know, it's very difficult. You know, the economics are against that, and the regulations which would be necessary to make that possible seem a very long way away from the reality in which we find ourselves. So, you know, these are the constraints under which we operate. I wish I could wave my hands and make them go away. The great majority of food writers wave their hands and make them go away. They pretend there is no innate conflict. They pretend everything's simple. Everything is not simple. Everything is really, really difficult in this subject.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Before I give the next and quite possibly last question from our side, let me announce to everyone that we will have a question and answer following, well, in about 10 minutes or so. So please feel very welcome to chip in your questions and answers. Piero will start to sort them and hand them to George. So maybe as a last one on kind of in our conversation, and I have a bunch of other questions on the kind of demand side. You already hinted to the role of the demand side, the consumer. Let me for the moment skip them, but rather give you a final supply side question. You mentioned the point of trade, and so well, quite obviously, it is a global issue. And one point that was raised in our discussions, let me give that as a challenge to you. And the point was that to some extent, your analysis is either taken a global perspective, of course, because it's a global system. But in terms of the examples, the initiatives, they're in a way somewhat, I'm doing you not unjust, otherwise you tell me, is to some extent European centered. I mean, that's our experience. That's your personal experience. I mean, Tolly, Tim, Ian, Pasi, and Finland, they're all European characters. Now, you have, on the other hand, a rather wide sweeping and we could say almost radical call for really getting rid of livestock farming, essentially to replace meat-based proteins by fermentized food, which would give the right proteins, but which could be shaped and transformed into wonderful food. I understand you've sampled some of that yourself. Now, the question we had, however, is that being a necessity, how do we deal with the fact that in the developing world, there's so many people actually relying on pasture farming, not necessarily on a large scale. That's one thing, the Brazil and the Argentine with these huge livestock farms, but also in a subsistence way. And reading your call, it sounds like, well, we should also get rid of those decentral places, but how do you go about this, and what prospects are there for people working in these professions?
Thank you. Yeah, so first of all, there is a reason why my examples all came close to home. It's because my research was conducted during the pandemic. I was planning to go to the Philippines and Kenya to look at some really interesting projects in both those countries, and unfortunately that was just curtailed. I could not do it because I couldn't travel during the restrictions. So that was a frustration. Although I must say that, you know, it is primarily aimed at Western consumers, because we're the biggest problem by a very long way, particularly with our diets, which are extremely high in animal products. And so, you know, I'm not taking aim at subsistence pastoralists, though I should point out that subsistence pastoralism is highly romanticized by us in the West. I worked for the best part of a year with pastoralists in East Africa in the early 1990s, and they were facing enormous difficulties, which have only got worse since then. Some of them are climate related, and the pastoral niche is one of the first parts of the human climate niche to close, and that has already closed in some parts of East Africa and the Horn of Africa, and it's closing rapidly in many other places. I mean, we're looking at people in semi-arid lands who are extremely vulnerable to climate disruption, and you know, I'm not attacking them. I'm not trying to put any pressure on them, but most of them will not be there in 30 or 40 years because it's just going to be impossible. It's terrifying. It's just horrendous. I mean, people in the early 1990s, many of those communities were already very close to the edge. And frankly, you know, I'm still in touch with some of the people that I've worked with. They've gone over the edge now. You know, it's just successive droughts wiping out all their animals, and however much they restock, they get wiped out again. And you can't keep sustaining yourself that way. You eventually, that is it, that it's curtains on that whole sector, and that is what's happening. And then it's exacerbated by a whole lot of other stuff which is going on, particularly in East Africa with land grabbing, some of it supported by the Kenyan government and the World Bank at the time, all sorts of terrible things happening. So we have this sort of very vague and rosy notion often, you know, oh, well, you know, indigenous people, they're living in harmony with nature, everything's great, we should imitate what they're doing. And the reality can be very, very different. And again, you know, it's the conversation has succumbed to romanticism and to pictures, whereas we have to be really realistic about this. We just have to recognize what's happening. And for most people, most small farmers, it's incredibly tough. It's always been tough, but it's just been ramped up a whole load of notches recently. We've seen several very interesting recent papers about the human climate niche, particularly one that was published I think it was just last month, and looking at just how rapidly that niche is going to close. And the first people always are the small subsistence farmers, and it's their niche that closes first. And so we have to take that into account in our planning. But, you know, my main concern is our phenomenal levels of animal product eating in countries like this. And that's why I think the new technologies that I discuss are possibly the most important environmental technologies ever developed, which is the cultivation of unicellular organisms as food sources. For 12,000 years, we've been refining the cultivation of multicellular organisms, plants and animals, and we push them more or less to the limits of efficiency. In fact, in some cases, I think we push them beyond the limits of efficiency. If you think of the chicken, in many chicken farms now, the chickens topple over onto their chests because their legs can no longer support their weight. I think we can fairly say we push them beyond the limits of efficiency, with horrendous consequences for chickens, but also for ecosystems upstream and downstream of those chicken factories. But we've scarcely in this 12,000 years begun to explore the potential of unicellular organisms, which is enormous. And you can produce protein-rich, fat-rich foods from unicellular organisms with a tiny fraction of the land, the water, the fertilizer required to produce that food from multicellular organisms. It's still farming. You can, if you want to call it that, you know, you're just farming something very small as opposed to much bigger things. But you can do it just much, much more efficiently. In fact, there's one study at Lund University looking at methanol-consuming bacteria, which is a very promising line. In fact, there's I went to visit a laboratory in Amsterdam a couple of months ago, where they found this methanol-consuming bacterium, which tastes and smells exactly like sausages. And to make sausages out of it requires far less processing than making sausages out of pigs. And this study at Lund University found that in growing methanol-consuming bacteria, you can use 1,700 times less land than the most efficient way of producing protein we have today, which is growing soy in the US. That means it uses 132,000 times less land than producing beef, and 168,000 times less land than producing lamb. And what this enables is a mass global rewilding, because if we start taking these huge and devastating ranches out of production here in the UK, in the US, in Australia, in Argentina, in Brazil, in New Zealand, which have done so much damage and dispossessed so many indigenous people, often with extreme violence, if we take those out of production and with local people rewild the land, we can not only stop the sixth great extinction in its tracks, but we can also draw down much of the carbon dioxide that's also been released into the atmosphere. In fact, it's really the only realistic and benign way of doing that. And I think our chances of survival hang on this. You know, I don't think we're going to get through this century, let alone those that follow, unless there's a great global rewilding.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. I mean, the efficiency argument, I mean, for me as economist is extremely compelling, and kind of just looking at the numbers. I mean, I guess you should have every economist worldwide on your side on this. I know it's probably a difficult bunch of people to convince, but cost benefit analysis is speaking its own word. On this note, I hand over to Piero to field some of the questions from the chat, and I think Piero also had one of his own. So I hand over, Piero, floors to you, and George.
I guess I'll park mine for a second, because there are quite a few coming in. If I may, perhaps you could try and give snap answers to this, because it seems quite popular. There is quite a few questions.
I think the chances of me giving a snap answer to anything are very small. I'll do my best.
Fair enough. So there's one that's quite ties well with the one your answer about monocellular organism. So a question from Anna Corolla. She's wondering whether there is a small but growing initiative to grow food in the oceans, for instance, seaweed, and whether you think that is a possible solution.
Thank you. Yes, Mono. It's a really interesting set of initiatives, some of which look quite promising. I think on the whole, we're looking at something which could be positive. I guess my fear is that we could see, knowing the logic of capitalism, the transformation of diverse marine ecosystems into monocultures, because everything within the capitalist system, everything degenerates into a monoculture. That's a sort of the almost the automatic progression as companies seek economies of scale. So on a small scale, seaweed farming, oyster farming and mussel farming, which actually, in terms of environmental impact, oysters and mussels are basically plants. I mean, I'm not saying they're plants in any other respect, but their environmental impact is much closer to plants than that of most animal products. So these are all quite positive things. The question is what happens when they scale up, and are we likely to see the replacement of far more complex ecosystems with the farming of single species? I mean, I don't know what it looks like yet, but what alarms me, I think, is that again we're looking at pictures. We're looking at these small-scale people pulling up ropes with several different species of seaweed growing on them, living in harmony with the marine ecosystem, etc. But we're not looking at what happens when this scales. What does it look like?
Thanks. With regards to growing food through bacteria and fungi, there is a question from Stefan Fritz. He says he thinks it's a great idea, to create meat or meat-like product in this way. The question for him is, will this be accepted by the bird population? And what, in your opinion, would take to make them more aware and keen on eating this kind of food?
Thank you. Another very good question. So the first thing I'd say is that when it comes to food, we're far less conservative than we tell ourselves we are. You know, we're always saying, I've always eaten like this and I always will. And in fact, you haven't always eaten like this. You know, our diets have changed radically over the course of just 1 or 2 generations. And we've shifted towards what some people call the global standard diet, which means that there's much less difference between what people in one nation eat and what people in another nation eat. Our foods become locally more diverse. You go into a supermarket and you'll see an incredible range of food, which would have just astonished your parents or your grandparents, but they're globally less diverse. It's broadly the same range of food as you would see in a supermarket on the other side of the world, often being produced by the same corporations. And so we've radically changed our diets, and we keep changing our diets. And in some respects, we change them in a very negative way, particularly towards more and more meat in our diets. But no one questions that. You know, no one says, you know, I can't possibly make that change. You just make the change. And I think what will make the difference with the unicellular products is price. That's going to be the persuasive argument, particularly when the companies who are making, you know, their chicken nuggets or their burgers or whatever it might be, find that they can source an identical product effectively, one that, you know, no consumer would tell was not the same thing, at half the price. Then we start seeing pressure from them. We start seeing the price pressure influencing the whole system. And then you start seeing the classic tipping points which you get in any commercial transition, where the margins of the old system get eroded, the economics of the new system just get better and better as a result, and you get a sudden replacement then through the S-curve of transition from the old system to the new system. And of course, the corporate lobbyists are already trying to stop that happening. There's a lot of lobbying against that transition taking place, as Piero will be particularly aware. In Italy, it's a very strong issue there. And then we have similar dynamics when it comes to the changing of tastes. You know, that as we get better and better products, and microbial products can make far better substitutes for animal products than plants can. Plants, you know, are really not a great place to start if you want to make something like an animal product. But then once you start getting beyond just trying to substitute animal products and start to tap into the enormous potential for completely new foods, then you start to get people very excited about innovating, about trying new stuff, about cooking with these new ingredients. And you know, and we can't picture what those new products will be any more than the first people to domesticate a wild cow were thinking about camembert. But there will be a really extraordinary range of new products which a lot of people will want to try.
Thanks. In the book, indeed, you mentioned big meat as this lobby, similarly to big oil, and indeed it is opposing regulation. You mentioned so that price and the media actually taking up all of this knowledge that is coming from scientifically circle are two potential transformative changes. I'm wondering about labeling. I'm thinking there is a lot of people that are sensitive to these issues and knowledgeable, but they just are not sufficiently empowered because they have no idea about the life cycle of the food products and the complex supply chains. Do you think there is potential for improving disclosure on this in labeling? And have you seen an example of this happening?
Well, we definitely need improvements, but I don't think we should exaggerate the impact that those will have. I mean, people don't read much of the label, to be honest. What they're really looking at is the price tag. That's a bit of the label which is most persuasive. And so I think it's much more effective to ensure that you regulate out the bad practice. You know, there's far too much weight put on the consumer to make the decisions which governments should actually be making. And there's been this whole sort of transition of the supposed locus of political power from the democratic system to the consumer. And in fact, we start to call ourselves the consumer rather than the citizen, which is how we should really see ourselves if we're going to be politically effective. And as consumers, there's actually very little we can do. You're right at the end of a long chain of decision making, and your decision is comparatively trivial by comparison to some of the decisions which have been made upstream. It's just much, much easier to get an effective system if it's effectively regulated from conception. You know, we shouldn't be faced with a choice in the shops between ethical and unethical products. We should be able to walk in the shop and know that everything on offer is an ethical product.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for this. So there is a question from Christopher Wong that is wondering whether the answer to these problems of food systems are only internal to the system or also external. And he makes example. For instance, should we not look at broad institutional structure in our society, for instance, that cause reliance on corporate processed food because we just don't have time to produce a whole meal from raw products? Could the move to short food value chains between consumer collectives and producer collectives also remove this control on our standard diet effectively?
Yes, there is some scope for that, but again, we have to recognize the constraints. You know, it's quite easy to talk about, oh, everyone should get together into consumer collectives and cooking collectives and things, and you know, and it's very easy for us to say that from our own isolated position in our own homes, and some people are prepared to do that, but a lot of people just have no capacity to do that. You know, one of the reasons for this switch in diets is that people are very time poor. I mean, I say this particularly from the United Kingdom, where there's been this massive deregulation of the labour market and downward pressure on wages. You know, even in a situation where we've got very low unemployment, that somehow they've managed to keep that downward pressure on wages at a time of inflation as well, so that people are working 2 or 3 jobs just to survive, primarily to pay the rent. They just don't have time. And the, you know, I mean, I love the idea of community kitchens, of people getting together, of eating together. You know, the word companion comes from the Latin companes, with bread. It's so fundamental to us, to our notion of society, that we should be preparing and eating food together. But where people are is very often a long, long way from that ideal. And so, you know, while we should pursue that ideal, we should recognize its constraints. And we should also recognize that if we're really going to transform things, it has to work with the rest of people's lives. Now, obviously, we need political and economic transformation as well. We need a far more egalitarian society. We need a far more democratic society, all of these things. But we also need, while pursuing those aims, to be acting right now to transform the food system at the same time. And a lot of that means making it as easy as possible for people, starting right where we are. And so, you know, if people are highly reliant on fast foods and ready meals, which a lot of people are, we've got to make those fast foods and ready meals much better. We've got to make them healthier. We've got to make them cheaper, because food has become tremendously expensive for people, and we have massively to reduce their environmental impacts. We can start doing all the other stuff as well. That's all fine. I'm not arguing against it, but I'm saying that if we want a genuine environmental transformation of our food system, it has to be the whole food system, not just the bits we like the sound of.
Thanks. One last question from the audience. An anonymous is asking, the fact that pastoralists face huge challenges abroad and in Europe and can continue this way of life is a product of environmental, political, and climate crisis. But it's not necessarily a reason to abandon the protection of that way of life and food production. If that is what communities want, isn't there an argument to find space for environmentally and socially just ways of food production within a wider global food system change as is needed?
Okay, well, let's look at the situation here in Europe. and the UK is still geographically part of Europe, so I think I can say here in Europe, throughout the whole of Europe, including still the UK, the only reason that there are any pastoral systems at all is because of public subsidies. It's governments paying for those pastoral systems. Our hills in Britain would have trees growing on them if it weren't for those public subsidies. We would have vigorous recovering ecosystems if it weren't for those public subsidies. It's only because we are pouring money into supporting people to keep their cattle and sheep on the land, one of the most destructive of all activities, that activity can persist. Now we could say, well, communities want that. And of course, people who are keeping cattle and sheep want to continue receiving that money. I would love it if, as a journalist, I could just receive public money, but it's an unreasonable demand, especially if what you're doing is environmentally harmful. And I'm not talking about banning anything here. And no point in the book where I say this should be banned. I mean, well, yes, actually, that's not quite true, because I think the spreading of sewage sludge on farmland, for instance, should be banned. The spreading of microplastics deliberately on farmland to make soil more friable should be banned. So there's one or two things like that. But I'm not talking about banning whole sectors or banning meat or anything like that. Just withdraw the public money, or rather repurpose the public money. Pay the same people to do something differently with that money. Now, if they want to carry on losing money by keeping cattle and sheep, that's fine. That's up to them. But we, the taxpayer, should not be paying for that. That's a totally unreasonable demand. Just as we should not be paying for coal. We should not be paying for oil drilling. We should not be paying for gas drilling. Public money should not be buying public harms. Public money should supply public goods. So we can pay the same people and say, instead of paying you to stay in cattle and sheep farming, we will pay you to get out of cattle and sheep farming and allow natural ecosystems back instead, and assist in the spread of those natural ecosystems. And there's a lot of work there to do. It will be cheaper for people to do that. They will make more profit off those public subsidies because cattle and sheep ranching is so loss-making. It's a massive drain on money. The average sheep farmer in my country, the UK, loses £16,600 a year by chasing sheep across rain-sodden hills. What's not to like? This is a really mad way to be doing things. It's a totally unnecessary way to be doing things. And if it comes to choice, we, the taxpayer, should exercise some choice. At the moment, when the farm subsidies are concerned, it's taxation without representation. We have absolutely no say in how that money is spent. It's just the farm lobby talking direct to government, which decides how that money should be spent. And you can say, well, that's community autonomy. Sorry, but what about the rest of us? Because of the subsidies, we've got a tremendous opportunity for a just transition in farming, to keep people on the land, to keep them in employment, but to get them doing something beneficial rather than something harmful. There's virtually no other sector where that is the case. To take my sector, I'm not asking for pity here, journalism's about to get wiped out by AI. No one's got a plan for that. No one seems to care about that. No one's talking about a just transition in journalism, just in farming, always in farming. And in farming, we can do the just transition. But everywhere, every sector is subject to massive disruptions. So let's have no more of this exceptionalism where there's something so special about farming that we can't contemplate any change, however damaging it is, however devastating it is to Earth systems. We have to keep doing it the way we're doing. No, we do not. We can accept change. It must be just, but that shouldn't stop us from saying that it's not right and it's not just, it's not fair to be spending public money on public harms.
Right. Thank you so much, George.
Oh, wow. It just disappeared. Okay, he's going to join us again. So I believe Michael was going to wrap up now. But before we do that, and before we thank you, there is one last question that we have, which is something a bit more introspective for us. Our business is system analysis, and we research food systems is our bread and butter. Do you, in your research, have you found some kind of known unknown, some key questions that science need to answer to help us transition to a just and sustainable food system, so that you would recommend IIASA scientists engage with?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of unanswered questions, really a huge amount, and not all of them are for science to answer. You know, we need much better political solutions. We need better social solutions. We need academics working across a very wide range of disciplines to see how we can create the transition that we need to see. I mean, I want to see a lot more research put into unicellular production. Apart from anything else, it's essential that is not subject to the same sort of corporate concentration that has happened in the existing food system. And for that to happen, we need a much more university-based research going into it. And that research should be kept, the outcomes of it should be kept in the public domain. We should not see intellectual property rights applying to it. But, you know, I've talked about soil and the need for much more work on that. We need a massive communications job to get existing work out there. But what I'm not going to do here is to tell you guys how to do your job, because I know that you do it much, much better than I could ever conceive. But I'm just saying, you know, carry on, spread your wings as wide as you possibly can. But above all, we've got to somehow find ways of communicating the outcomes of this work to policymakers and showing just how important it is that we become numerate in these fields, that we begin to understand these crucial, complex fields and not constantly simplify them in the way that the media and politicians do.
Thank you so much, George. This was really inspiring and illuminating. Thank you also on behalf of Michael, that I hope is going to join us again soon. And on behalf of everyone, I'm sure everyone appreciated your honest and informative answers. And I look forward to our next encounter.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Piero. Bye, everyone. Thank you.